Good afternoon. Obviously, this is a very difficult day and a difficult report to receive from the Mass Casualty Commission, but it pales in comparison to what the families of the victims of this tragedy have had to go through over the last 2.5 years. And that is why it was so important that I be here today, that the Prime Minister be here today, that we be here to show support to the families of the victims, and yes, to receive the recommendations which have been put forward thoughtfully by the Commission. We will now take the time that is necessary to absorb those recommendations which touch on a number of critically important issues with regards to the police response to this tragedy. We are committed to making the changes that are necessary, not only to mend the trust between the police and the community here in Nova Scotia, but to ensure that this kind of tragedy never occurs again, and so that we can keep all Canadians safe. Donc, c'est un jour très dur, c'est un très difficile rapport d'accepter de la Commission, mais tout nos cœurs est avec la famille de la victime. C'est une période qui restait extrêmement difficile pour eux. Ça, c'est la raison que le gouvernement rester dévoué à accepter les recommandations et les suggestions de la Commission, d'étudier leurs recommandations et de faire les changements qu'il faut pour improver la confiance de la communauté entre eux et la GRC, pas seulement ici à Nouvelle-Écosse, mais partout au Canada, et pour faire le changement pour prévenir notre tragédie comme cela. Donc, on va continuer dans un esprit de dévouement pour la communauté. Maintenant, je suis prêt pour les questions.
Katani, CBC.
Tony from I don't know if is my mic okay, we're good now. Okay. Don't know if you just heard, but the interim commissioner of the RCMP, someone who you just recently appointed, said he has not read the report despite receiving at least elements of it hours ago, yesterday actually. You know, as we talk about accountability about the RCMP, is that acceptable?
Well, I want to say a few things in response to that because it's a very important question. The first thing that I want to highlight is that you heard Commissioner Duhaime accept on behalf of the RCMP their responsibility for the significant shortcomings in their response to this tragedy. And I think that was important for the families in the community here for him to make that an acknowledgement. Second, you also heard Commissioner Duhaime fully commit to studying those recommendations which were issued so that we can make the changes that are necessary. And you also heard Commissioner Duhaime apologize to the families of the victims for not being able to protect them on those 2 days, over that 13-hour period, which is their paramount responsibility. And my job as the Minister of Public Safety is to hold the RCMP and law enforcement to account to ensure that we make the reforms that are necessary so that this kind of tragedy never happens again, and that is precisely a commitment that we will make good on.
Outside of that, I understand that you didn't have the same kind of leeway about the report, but you must have read some of the findings by now. One of the main ones being, you know, asking you to take on a review of the RCMP's culture and structure. Not the first time that recommendation has been made. Will you at least commit to that one?
Of course. And to be clear, I received the report earlier today, and since receiving it, and obviously after participating in the announcement with the Commission and being present with the families, I have begun studying the recommendations which touch on a number of critically important issues, including police protocols, reporting, alerting, training, leadership, the relationship between police and elected government representatives and the community itself. I think it's important for me to highlight that over the course of the day I had a chance to have a brief conversation with Premier Houston Our government's commitment is to work with him and to work with all provincial and territorial partners so that this kind of tragedy never occurs again.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Jones. I'm with the Globe and Mail. And my question is around, will one of the recommendations to pass a bill already before Parliament to recommending to change the RCMP Act to minimize ministerial direction and other influence on the RCMP?
Well, I think your question touches on the need to respect operational independence. And that is something that this government has done and will continue to do going forward. This is a principle that I am familiar with. Prior to getting into politics as a federal prosecutor, I understand the difference in the functions that are undertaken by police in their response on the ground operationally, and what my job is as the Minister for Public Safety, which is not to meddle in those operational responses, but rather to set policy direction and priorities and to make sure that the police have the tools and the resources that are necessary. You also mentioned a ministerial direction. Again, there's a recommendation that touches specifically on that point. We're going to study that very carefully. But I also want to assure you that as part of my mandate, and a mandate that I shared with the RCMP last spring, we're committed to strengthening oversight, to strengthening accountability, to strengthening transparency, so that Canadians can have trust and confidence in the RCMP and all of their law enforcement institutions.
So will you change the Police Act to include that recommendation from the Commission?
We are going to study the recommendations very carefully, and we will continue to do that while at the same time advancing the reforms that are in the mandate which I issued to the RCMP.
Bonjour, Adrien Blanc de Radio-Canada. Si je comprends bien, sur des recommandations comme celle-ci ou d'autres, vous vous réservez la possibilité de dire non, nous refusons ces recommandations?
Nous devons faire les changements qu'il faut pour réformer la GRC et toutes les institutions qui sont impliquées dans la priorité de sécurité publique. C'est une tragédie qui est inacceptable. Et c'était extrêmement difficile pour eux qui ont perdu un de leurs proches, les membres de la famille. J'ai une opportunité pour exprimer mes condoléances la dernière année. J'avais une conversation tellement difficile avec Nick Beaton et même avec des autres. Mais le dévouement de le gouvernement est de continuer avec un agenda de réformation pour améliorer la confiance entre la GRC et les communautés et pour prévenir une autre tragédie comme celle-là.
La Commission recommande d'interdire les armes semi-automatiques avec plus de 5 balles. Est-ce que c'est le même projet de loi que présenté par les libéraux? Est-ce que vous allez inclure cette recommandation dans votre défense de ce projet de loi?
Mais écoute, c'est la plus grave tragédie fusillade dans l'histoire de le pays, ici, à Nouvelle-Écosse. Et ça, c'est la raison qu'on avait, en tant que ministère de Sécurité publique, en tant que gouvernement fédéral, on a un agenda pour avancer des politiques qui font de bon sens sur le sujet de le règlement sur les armes à feu, les armes d'assaut. Ça, c'est la raison de continuer de faire des investissements à la frontière pour arrêter le trafiquant des armes à feu illégales. Et aussi, ça, c'est la raison qu'il faut faire les investissements sur le terrain pour adresser les causes profondément, pour prévenir une autre tragédie comme celle-là. Et ça, c'est exactement ce que la Commission a dit plus tôt aujourd'hui, qu'il faut aussi adresser les déterminants sociaux pour prévenir des tragédies causées par les armes à feu et la violence.
Good afternoon, Minister. Brett Ruskin, CBC News. Moving away from perhaps having seen the recommendations, studying the recommendations, can I just ask you what you think that the relationship or the communication method should be between yourself or someone in your office with the RCMP commissioner. There is a recommendation in the report talking about that only being written, trackable, public communications. Would that be good? Would that make things more difficult if, in theory, communications were limited to just written statements, written emails or notes?
I believe that anytime there is a crisis or there may be an episode that involves mass casualties and violence like the one that we saw very tragically here over 2.5 years ago in Nova Scotia, that there does need to be strong lines of communication between law enforcement and government, because the government also shares a responsibility in communicating timely information so as to amplify the efforts of the police to restore law and order, to save lives, and to keep communities safe. But while we keep those lines of communication open, of course, there needs to be a respect for the operational independence of police. And transparency is important for the purposes of being accountable. You mentioned that there is a recommendation that touches on this issue. We're going to study that recommendation very carefully. But I assure you that as we study that, we will continue to make the reforms that are necessary to restore the trust. As you heard Commissioner Duhaime say, as you heard Commissioner MacDonald say, it is imperative that we restore the trust between the community here and the RCMP so that they can fulfill their first objective, their top objective, their paramount goal, and that is to keep Canadians safe.
And just as a follow-up about a recommendation that I'll bring out specifically this time, apologize, but there is a recommendation, kind of an interesting one, that looks at the amount of money that federally goes to subsidize the RCMP's contract here in Nova Scotia. So the Nova Scotia government hires the RCMP to provide policing here, and the federal government subsidizes that payment. And the recommendation is take that amount, that subsidy, and also use or have an equal amount invested into a mental health program here in Nova Scotia. We don't know what the amount is. Well, I've asked commissioners, I've asked the Premier what the amount is, but what do you think of that idea?
I think it's an idea worth exploring, and I would say a couple of things in response. First, our commitment is to work in lockstep with the province of Nova Scotia. That is a commitment that I made to Premier Houston and to my counterpart, Minister Brad Johns, in the lead up to the issuing of this report. But secondly, that this government has already begun to take a number of significant steps towards advancing those strategies that are aimed at preventing gun crime and violence from occurring in the first instance, through, among other initiatives, the creation of the Building Safer Communities Fund. And the entire point of this fund is to enhance the capacity of frontline service providers who are there to offer mental health supports, who are there to provide people who are at risk to being exposed to violence with the additional tools that they need to stop crime and loss and tragedy like we saw here before it ever starts. We need to do more of that. And we will continue to work closely with all levels of government, law enforcement, grassroots organizations, so that we can prevent crimes and tragedies like this from ever occurring again.
Last question. Dernière question.
Alex Cook, Global News. I just wanted to clarify one of your previous responses. Will the government commit to ordering an external and independent review of the RCMP?
In the first case, we are going to study that recommendation along with all of the others that were issued today by the Commission very carefully. And at a high level and as a broad principle, we will make whatever changes are necessary to restore the trust between the RCMP and the community here, and to do whatever is necessary to prevent a tragedy like this from happening. While we commit to doing that work, in the context of this commission report. We are also at the same time advancing significant reforms to the RCMP through the mandate letter that was issued to me by the Prime Minister and from me to the RCMP in turn last spring. A number of the priorities in that mandate letter look to strengthening oversight and review, including through a bill that we introduced not too long ago, Bill C-20, which would create a new Public Complaints Review Commission to ensure that that trust is there. We need to be a full court press on all of these changes so that we can protect communities and ensure that a tragedy like this never occurs again.
And in terms of the issue of domestic violence and gender-based violence, I believe the word that the report used was endemic. Do you agree with that? And what do you make of the recommendation to revoke firearms licenses for those convicted of domestic abuse?
Of course I agree. For far too long, there have been way too many barriers that prevent women from coming forward because they don't feel that they will be trusted, because they don't feel that they can open up to the people who are charged with the responsibility of protecting them. And the Commission report touches on that too, and we have to redouble our efforts when it comes to reducing those barriers so that women feel safe, so that they can come forward, so that we can reduce gender-based violence. And that is work that I am doing in cooperation with Minister Ian, my colleague who is responsible for advancing these issues as well. But there's no doubt that there is still a long way to go, and that's why we're going to study these recommendations with the urgency that is required, commensurate to the magnitude of this tragedy, so that we can make the changes that are necessary so that women trust law enforcement and all Canadians can trust in law enforcement to protect them.
Thank you. Merci tout le monde. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. This concludes the press conference. Thank you.